Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of A Foggy Day on Olympus. As our regular viewers will know by now, Coel and I, my name's Mike Pierce, we are actually Greek gods living up on Mount Olympus, delivering Olympian judgments on mere mortals and their foolish squabbles from way, way up high. But as some of you might have noticed over the months, it tends to be a bit misty up here. So our Olympian judgments aren't necessarily as infallible as we would want them to be. We focus on this channel on questions of history, religion, and culture, and why they matter.
And today is the third episode in our catchy title series, Sexual Chaos and Identity Crisis. So what we're going to be talking about today is the gift that keeps giving, the 1960s sexual revolution and its consequences, which is a topic that I think you and I have been kicking around back and forth over the years. And certainly I have learned a lot about, since I wasn't alive then, so I've just been had to be handed accounts.
All your troubles were fault of, well, actually not even quite my generation, but the people just a little bit older than me.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have somebody else to blame for all of our problems. So
it is really, yes.
But everybody calls what happened in the 1960s the sexual revolution. So why was that decade so decisive? Did everyone suddenly go from being chaste to suddenly being promiscuous?
Well, the answer to the first question in 2 words is the pill, which had a dramatic effect. But we'd be deluding ourselves if we didn't admit from the outset that things had been drifting in this kind of direction for several generations. I mean, most eye-catchingly, this kind of behavior was absolutely rife in the entertainment industry, most notably Hollywood. Also, it's there generally. C.S. Lewis, back in the late 40s, 1950s maybe, commented on how people in the university were very frequently sleeping around. And if you look in the mid-1950s, I mean, it would be absolutely ridiculous not to admit that Elvis the Pelvis's contortions and convulsions were absolutely sexual and intended to be so, right? And that's why all the girls were screaming, right? So, yes, the 1960s really did change everything, but things had been moving that way for a while. But as we'll see in a moment, the introduction of the contraceptive pill in the 1960s really did mark an absolute watershed in this situation. Yes. Yeah. Now, one book that we really want to strongly recommend to people is Primal Screams: How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics. Now, we're going to name check a couple of other books in a couple of minutes, but this is the one that we really want to take off from today, because she's making the connection between what happened in the 1960s and the crisis of identity that millions upon millions of not just young people, but even middle-aged people are experiencing today. And we've been giving the lead up to that in the first couple of episodes. So she's a very important Catholic American commentator on these matters. You know this book pretty well yourself. What did you make of it?
Yeah, I read this book right around the same time as Carl Trueman's book that we mentioned last week, and it was a very eye-opening time, especially when you read both of them back to back. There's just a lot of information. But the only thing that I found frustrating about this book is that every point that she made, I was like, oh yes, that totally makes sense. But I just wanted to grab her and say, well, what are we gonna do about it? she she details the problems so well and
Yes.
explains where they're coming from that you really can see what she's saying. But yeah, then I wanted to know what the solution was. So
Right, right. Well, one of the problems of being a historian is that we deal with problems and not answers, and that can get people mad at us.
no wonder I find you so frustrating. Yes.
That's the secret of it all. After all these years, there it is. It's right there. Yeah, yeah. But I mean, you mentioned Carl Trueman's book that we flagged up in last week's episode, and although they're very different books in many ways, Carl Trueman's book is intellectually heavy going, and it's an intellectual history, albeit what he's interested in is the same thing I'm interested in, which is popular intellectual history. What happens to these big ideas when they seep down? And what she's looking at really is something rather more sociological, but they're both engaged in the same enterprise, which is pointing out the mistake that many people make when they look at the modern phenomenon of woke
Mhm.
and simply deride it and belittle it, and its claims are stupid, and they are stupid, as if people who think this way are themselves stupid, and that somehow by mocking them, you're going to knock them out of it. And that's never going to happen any more than people on the left mocking whether it's Trump supporters in America or some of the insurgent new right wing forces in Europe as stupid. And again, they are stupid, right? That somehow they're going to stop. That's not going to happen. And what needs to happen in both cases, and here we're just dealing with this one, the woke phenomenon, is that we need to understand the roots of how people came to espouse these ideas that, however crazy they may be, seem very meaningful to them and about which they are very passionate.
Mhm.
And what Mary Eberstadt is doing is locating the origins of this squarely in the 1960s, the devastating consequences that keep cascading down to the present. And on that, I think she's just wonderful. Yes.
And if anybody has attempted Carl Trueman's book since we've talked about it and found it a little difficult to read, they will be happy to know that I found this book to be much easier to get through.
Yeah, if somebody's reasonably literate, I can't see them having much of a problem reading her book. It's a much easier read. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, she's also got previous, as the police would say when speaking about criminals, in that she's written similar kinds of books. So this is something from a number of years ago, Adam and Eve After the Pill, and again she's looking at the same kind of phenomenon here, the paradoxes of the sexual revolution. And I'd also like to flag up again a book that we mentioned in the third episode of our series on apologetics, and that's Louise Perry's The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, which has become a bestseller just in the last couple of years. And as we mentioned when we name checked her before, she's a feminist engaged she was engaged in helping survivors of sexual violence, but her work led her to conclusions which to a previous generation would have counted as obvious, but seem radical now. Until very recently, at least, she was an atheist. Maybe she still is, I'm not sure. But her podcast, Maiden Mother Matriarch, which wonderful, wonderful podcast, actively promotes Christianity. So she's exploring it for herself. She's another one of this raft of people who've come out of atheistic kind of backgrounds and at some point thought, wait a minute, something's up here. Yeah. So
Right.
yeah, all of those, but again, not to detract from Mary Eberstadt's primal screams, because she's the one who's linking this phenomenon to modern identity politics.
Mhm.
Well, we're going to do something we haven't done before now. We're going to have a little musical break. And this is a tolerably recent production, I think maybe about 10 years old, of what was a very popular song, first launched back in 1949 Baby, it's cold outside.
I really can't stay.
Baby, it's cold outside.
I gotta go away.
Baby, it's cold outside.
This evening has been
Hoping that you dropped
so
in.
very nice.
I'll hold your hands, they're just like
My
ice.
mother will start to worry.
Beautiful, what's your
My father
hurry?
will be pacing the floor.
Listen to that fireplace
So
roar.
really I'd better scurry.
Beautiful, please don't
Or
hurry.
maybe just a soda pop
I'll put
more.
some records on while I
The
pour.
neighbors might think,
Baby, it's bad out there.
say, was that a wink?
No cabs to be had out there.
I wish I knew
Your
how
eyes are like starlight
to
now.
break this spell.
I'll take your hat. Your hair looks
I ought
swell.
to get home for dinner.
Mind if I move
So
in
it's time
closer?
for me to cast you aside.
Oh, what's the sense of hurting my
I
pride?
really can't stay.
Baby, don't hold out. Baby, it's cold outside.
I simply must go.
Baby, it's cold outside.
So thanks for the show.
But baby, it's cold outside.
The welcome has been
How lucky that you
so
dropped in.
nice and warm.
Look out the window at that
My
storm.
sister will be suspicious.
Gosh, your lips look
My brother
delicious.
will be there at the door.
Waves upon a tropical
My
shore.
maiden aunt's mind is
Gosh,
vicious.
your lips are
Maybe
delicious.
just another dance
Never
floor.
such a blizzard before.
I gotta get home.
Baby, you freeze out there.
Say, lend me your comb.
It's up to your knees out there.
You've really been grand.
I feel when I touch your
But
hand.
don't you see?
How can you do this thing to
There's
me?
bound to be a talk tomorrow.
Think of my lifelong
At least there'll
sorrow.
be plenty in play.
If you got pneumonia and
I
die,
really can't stay.
get over that hold up. Baby, it's cold. Baby, it's cold outside.
Okay, so in the song, the girl has all of these excuses as to why she needs to go. My mother will start to worry. My father will be pacing the floor. The neighbours might think, I ought to get home for dinner. My sister will be suspicious. My brother will be there at the door. My maiden aunt's mind is vicious. There's bound to be talk tomorrow. And at the time this was launched, this was considered to be a humorous song. And it was taken in that vein until quite recently. But it's a bit more controversial now.
Yeah, I'll never forget a few years ago, this was really in the hot seat, and I think people were trying to ban the song and saying that nobody should be listening to it, which I was really confused about because it didn't really occur to me, I guess, that it was so malicious, but I think a lot of people were saying, oh, suddenly determined, 60 years later, that the meaning of the song was about rape or something like that, which seems a little harsh. But yeah, certainly you get this picture of a woman trying to resist the advances of a man, and I don't think there's a woman alive in a Western country, especially in the US, who hasn't felt this at some point. I mean, yeah, it's pretty prevalent that you're making excuses for yourself eventually.
I mean, it's kind of a little perplexing because back in the late 1940s when sexual mores were loosening, but clearly a lot tighter than they are now. This was considered humorous. So the objections to it in recent years have not been on grounds of sexual propriety, but on grounds of pressure on women.
Right.
And that's the thing that has changed, right?
Mm.
In fact, this particular version that we just showed you also came under even more fire because they're employing children in the production of it. Although I really don't think that there was anything untoward in respect to those children there. It was meant to be cute rather than anything else, but there we are.
Right.
So, yeah, mores have changed radically since this song first came out.
What I think too is interesting that most of these excuses are pertaining to the woman's family members or her neighbors or something. And it's funny that now those sort of excuses would be considered so oppressive, you know, if a woman was to call back to her family as an excuse. But I feel like in a healthy family dynamic, and the way that it used to be was that it was actually a good thing, that these were layers of protection that a woman had that oftentimes women just don't have anymore.
Right. Yes, that's what's been taken away, and particularly and dramatically so during the 1960s, because before that, although there certainly were contraceptives, they were not particularly reliable, whereas the pill was a lot more reliable than anything that had gone before it. And that really, instead of empowering women, it actually disempowered them. So before there are all these excuses, and the excuses are only semi-plausible, but they were things that women, the kind of things that women could say, and generally the man would then back off, whereas those came to seem increasingly absurd. But actually what that did was to disempower women. Now this brings us to another book I want to mention here. It's a little old now. It came out in 1996 and it was a bestseller and it sold by the millions. A Return to Modesty by Wendy Shalit. Now, I remember reading this, recommending it to my classes back when I taught in a college in London, and it was taken up enthusiastically. I managed to find somebody who gave us a job lot and sold off about 50 or 60 copies of this book cheap to practically every student in a particular cohort. But I remember reading it for myself and being astounded at the way she blended academic sociology and psychology with the productions of trashy girly magazines. And she'd pick up on those and show how they illustrated her various points. I remember getting to the last page, finishing it, closing it, putting my head down the desk and thinking, I am wasting my life. 23. This woman is 23. That's all. What the heck am I doing?
Wow.
She caused some outrage amongst the politically correct establishment, let us say, by the point that she was making. The point was that modesty was empowering of women and that getting rid of it was fundamentally disempowering. Modesty, whether in respect of clothing or behavior or what have you. And she picked up on this song, actually, and its lyrics, and asked the question rhetorically, what does it mean for young women when all of these excuses are peeled away and you no longer have them? And the conclusion is pretty strong. You know, how disempowering is it for women when that raft of excuses is taken away? Well, it's actually very disempowering.
Right.
Now, please spare us any graphic details, but when you were single, did you often get this kind of pressure from boyfriends? And how often were you able to fall back on the family excuse and so on?
Yes. I don't think I can recall a single relationship where this wasn't a constant theme or struggle, except for with my husband.
Which is why you married him.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I honestly think that it's only by God's grace that I really could have ended up in some dangerous situations. So yeah, it's extremely prevalent, even for somebody, I think, who is quote unquote a good Christian girl.
Well, yeah, because people are bad, and in this area, boys tend to be badder than girls on the law of average, not always, of course. Yeah.
Right, right.
Well, before we dive into the nitty gritty of how the coming of the pill worked itself out, let's just go back in time here and look at this famous lady, Dorothy Day, who is still very much beloved amongst social campaigners, particularly on the left. That was the kind of stuff in respect of trade union rights and this sort of thing that she spent her lifetime involved with. But as a young woman, she had a number of sexual relationships, and in her late 20s came belatedly to a realization. She said, "I thought I was a free and emancipated young woman, and found out I wasn't at all. Freedom is just a modernity gown, a new trapping that we women affect to capture the man that we want. So in a generally promiscuous environment, the pressure is all on women to behave in ways that they would not necessarily prefer if they want to get that man." And eventually she drew a line under that, and she was a deeply committed Catholic for the rest of her life. It wouldn't be surprised me if one day she ends up being canonized for something for all of her social good works and what have you. But yes, we can't pursue that now. But that observation, I think, is highly illuminating.
Yeah, I've always found it funny that the popular girls, or the girls that were considered the most desirable in high school or something, were always sort of the loud and brazen, maybe is the word to use. And it always made me laugh that they would act this way, but then say something like, "Well, I don't understand why men won't leave me alone." I'm like, well,
Yes.
it's impossible to walk into a room and not notice that you're there.
Right. Yes. Not a popular point to make, but it's a universal observation.
Right. Yeah. Yes. And I personally, of course, was far above these tactics.
Of course you were, yes. Well, Laura. Right, trying to think about that. Moving swiftly on. So just to reiterate, what we're doing here is drawing the line, the connection from the huge intensification of this change in behaviour that we call the sexual revolution in the 1960s to the identity politics and the crisis of identity that many millions of people experience today. Well, the first domino is, of course, the pill. So it's reliable contraception. Well, nothing's entirely reliable except the word no, I suppose, but basically reliable from 1963. As I said, there had been contraceptives before this, but they were intrusive and less reliable. So the reasons not to be promiscuous are now greatly reduced, and young men took full advantage of this. And also, the immediate consequence of that is that they become even harder to tie down to the commitment of marriage. For reasons that will be obvious to most people, but I suppose will sound extremely universal to state in the current environment, young men were always harder to tie down than young women because they could make their own way in the world, etc., without obvious danger to themselves in a way that wasn't true of women. It wasn't just about regulations, it was about common sense, including the risk of pregnancy. But now that the pill has come in, they're even harder to tie down because they feel they can have things that they want without having to make that kind of commitment. Right? And this is a process that has continued right down to the present. So the pressure is now on young women to abandon their natural psychological caution before sex and their emotional devastation after being abandoned. So they must be able to function emotionally as men. And if you look back at a lot of the rhetoric from the 1960s and early 1970s, it's about young women not having hang-ups. And what that's code for is the social pressure to abandon the feelings that they naturally have, whether before taking a plunge into sex or being abandoned afterwards.
Yeah, I see this often portrayed even in TV shows or media or things like that, that everybody is talking about this, how hard it is for women to have casual sex, but yet it's still expected that you're able to do that. Everybody knows, I think on some level, that this is not the way that things were intended to be, but the rhetoric isn't changing.
Right, right. Well, the second domino then is the emergence of modern feminism. Now, I want to be careful here in our categories, just very, very briefly, because we can't branch off into this now. You can trace feminism back to, well, Mary Wollstonecraft at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th centuries, and the campaigns in the 19th century for women to have more property rights and so on, and concerning divorce laws, things like this. The second wave, that of course is strongly emphasized in school curricula now, is the campaign certainly in Britain and America, but other countries too, for women to get the vote, the suffragettes. Right? Those campaigns ran in the late 19th century and were mostly successful in the early 20th century. But this is a new wave now, and it's kind of kicked into action by the coming of the pill and the sexual revolution that's unleashed and the pressures that's put upon women. There are soaring numbers by the late 1960s and in the early 1970s of unwed mothers. Because even though the pill is there, A, it doesn't work all the time, B, people didn't always take it as regularly as they should, as with most medications, right? And so you do, in fact, get much larger numbers of births out of wedlock. Historically, that number had been around 2 to 3%, and it now starts to move up quite sharply. And also lone parents, but maybe women who've been married, but the divorce rate starts to soar because, of course, sex lives are more chaotic and more people are dabbling outside of their marriages, and that leads to breakups, and then there's women left with children that way. And that led to sharply increased demand by feminists for 1, equal access to all jobs, 2, equal pay for equal work, 3, equal access to higher education, and 4, government financial support where male breadwinners were absent. If men could leave women, in the lurch, then women must be empowered to provide for themselves. And that meant that they must be able to function socially, and we should probably have added economically, as men as well. So that's another step. Now, feminists would tell you, Coel, with good reason, that these were changes achieved not so very long before you were born and from which you benefit. And even though you don't claim to be a feminist, you'd be very unwilling to see these things go, I think.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I feel like I have such a love-hate relationship with feminism because like you said, there's so many waves of it and there's so many different interpretations now of what feminism means. And so I do think it's true. Women should definitely have access to these things. But I think what I wish would change is the pressure that society puts on women to chase after these things, especially when it often comes at the expense of families and babies. And so, the woman that's told that you need to have your career first before you start having children, and then it's taking women a long time to have babies, and then the longer you wait, the more difficult it is, and so things like that. But I think also, like you said, the economic situation is the most frustrating because it's even difficult to be living in a family with a single income. So now having two incomes is almost always necessary, which is such a shame because I think being present, I heard a study recently that being present for the first 3 years of a child's life really influences how they're going to develop. And so even if you're working a full-time job and the child is being taken care of by somebody else, they're still experiencing it as something like a low-level trauma where
Right.
they're not spending enough time with their biological mother. And what I think is really frustrating about this is that women, I really believe, know that instinctively, that after they have a baby, they don't want to go back to work in 6 weeks or whatever it is. And everybody says, well, that's just mommy guilt, that's just mommy blues,
Right.
just
Right.
go back to work. Yeah, turn off your natural instincts, leave your baby behind with somebody else and go back to work, and you'll be more fulfilled that way. And I find that incredibly frustrating.
Right. Right. I mean, I think a lot of women like you in the present who would either reject the label of feminist or get ticked off with current feminists, what they're actually rejecting is the way that that manifests itself now, rather than a desire to unpick what happened earlier. But
Yes.
of course, what we're pointing out here is that even some of those things that happened earlier, say in the 1970s and the 1980s, I guess, these changes happened, were themselves the product of the sexual revolution. Right? They may have been things that, in retrospect, we can look back and say, oh, they should have happened a long time ago. But what actually kicked them into making them unstoppable forces was the new vulnerability of women in the light of the sexual revolution. But of course, at the time, people didn't talk about these developments in those terms. But looking back on them, and as we see, the order in which these changes happened, it's kind of blindingly obvious
Right.
that the one thing leads to another. Right. Well, we've got here a picture of a women's liberation demonstration in New York. This new style feminism was often simply called the Women's Liberation Movement, or Women's Lib for short. That label didn't last more than about a decade, and then everybody learned to say feminism. Well, and if men couldn't be relied on to become providers, then anything less than equal treatment in jobs, hiring, and pay was an outrage. So we've got a picture here of female staff at Newsweek magazine going on strike over just these issues in 1970. Further, if sex was just a recreational activity, women shouldn't be left with babies they didn't want. And so abortion was legalized in most Western countries in the late 1960s and early 1970s, with huge implications for views about the value of human life. Now, just to keep this straight here and not to overstate, we're trying not to overstate any of these claims, abortion had been legalized in all of the communist countries, and of course this has happened during the Cold War, because they're under Marxist regimes, and under Marxism, people are just animals, and unborn babies are just lumps of flesh. And so they had, most of them, free abortion, and it was considered to be a normal method of birth control. Right? But in the West, that wasn't the case. But nevertheless, that kind of Christian or Judeo-Christian heritage is peeled back during these years. Now, here is one of the most controversial lines I included in my book, Why the Rest Hates the West. Finally, the abortion laws exist to make the world safe for promiscuity. If you doubt that, look at when they were introduced, right? In Britain in 1968, in the US in 1973, and the other major Western countries, it's either just before or just after those dates, or in between those two dates. That's the period when it happens. It is the immediate kickback from the sexual revolution of the 1960s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's pretty difficult to argue with, and maybe somebody will take a stab at it in the comments. But my
Sure they will.
yeah, my personal, this is just personally, my political opinion is to be pro-life. But I say that very gently because, like with the feminist argument, I really feel for the women who are in often very desperate circumstances.
Right.
And so I wouldn't say that abortion is necessary, but help for these women who are in these situations of being now suddenly a single mother or whatever it is. I think absolutely we need to be able to help those women. And so I think that if you are pro life, then there is a certain responsibility to being willing to contributing help and resources to women who are in these situations. So,
Right. And we should point out that a lot of churches and Christian organizations do provide exactly this. But then if you're going to campaign about this at a political level, then that goes hand in hand with a willingness to see government make provision in these kinds of circumstances. Otherwise, it's kind of hypocritical, really. So, yes. Well, again, if sex is just fun rather than the sacrosanct way of generating more people, then restrictions seem merely oppressive. Any restrictions. So homosexuality is legalized during the same period. And here we've got a picture of a gay rights demonstration. And another one here. Freud, of course, had insisted that sex was the core of our identity. And the gay movement, like this group here in 1970, pick up on this idea that homosexuality isn't an activity, it's the core of who you are, your identity, which of course is something that's very powerfully with us today, right?
mm-hmm.
That idea.
And also something that makes me laugh a little bit, because it's so weird when you think about this. Like, why would I want the details of my private sex life to become my public identity? And yet this is what we stake our reputation on. So,
well, yes, that is indeed the case. But I mean, again, it's part of the whole movement of the 60s and 70s, the favored phrase from the hippie period, let it all hang out. The idea was that you were being more authentic, not just actually in the area of sex, but generally. And of course, what we've found is, again, not just in the area of sex, but generally, that we're not more authentic than those who went before us. We've just lost our dignity, self-respect, and along with it, our respect for one another. And we would do quite well to backpedal, again, not just in the area of sex, but all of these other things too. Yes. Well, in America, at least, Illinois was the first US state to decriminalize same-sex activity in 1962. Other states followed during the next couple of decades, and all remaining restrictions, which just somebody somewhere had forgotten to undo, were invalidated in 2003. In 1967, the UK legalized homosexuality. But even so, this graph, which I just came across the other day, is kind of revealing. Look at the title here. This is support amongst the public in America, I think, for legalizing not gay marriage, but just gay sexual relations. So it would appear that even in 2020, there's about 24% of the population who don't think that this should be legal even now. But of course, the impression that you get from public media and everything else is that it's practically unanimous, right? But nevertheless, there has been a sharp upward tick. You notice the downward step there in the late 1980s with the emergence of AIDS and so on, but then it soon resumes its upward trajectory. Well, the third domino is with the catastrophic effect on family life. Angry women and lost children. Obviously, cave women could not both hunt and hold a baby, and their modern sisters found that they couldn't have it all, career and babies. Though millions and millions of them tried, either because they wanted to, genuinely, or they felt some kind of pressure to, whether economic pressure or peer pressure. Now, this leads to delayed motherhood and fast falling birth rates and increased childlessness.
But why would the new situation lead to delayed motherhood?
Well, a lot of people will point to much greater female participation in higher education, and that's certainly true. And then in making careers. But if you think about it, as we mentioned a moment ago, even those things are coming from the need for women now to be, as it were, economically self-sufficient, because they know they can no longer rely upon men. So that in itself is going to delay, well, mostly marriage and certainly motherhood. But also, given that men are harder and harder to tie down, it's going to take most women longer to lasso one of them and truss them up into the necessary, social situation where that can happen. Oh, but I mean, we're in danger of overstating this because, of course, to some extent, the new sexual permissions will have seemed actually attractive to maybe not all young women, but to a number of them as well. So a period of sexual experimentation and so on, even if most of them ended up getting bruised and hurt as a result. But certainly by now, the consequence is overwhelming. Birth rates have plummeted in recent decades. It looked for a while as though the US was holding up. In the early years of this century, it was the only Western country to have replacement birth rates, but it's now down there with the rest. But as I discovered myself just a few months ago, actually, the number of children that women who become mothers have is about the same now as it was 50 years ago. It's about 2.3, 2.4 per woman. But what's leading to the disaster is the soaring number of women who never have children, right? And that's leading to, in the case of the US, it's about 1.7 per woman average. Quick reminder for people who don't follow these things, the replacement number is 2.1 per woman. Okay. So above 2.1, growing population. Below 2.1, falling population. 1.7, pretty disastrous. Most European countries, 1.4 or below. Okay, so it leads to that, but it also leads to physical and emotional exhaustion for loads of women because it's so hard to do the two things. And also profound feelings of guilt about maternal inadequacy, which is a bonanza for advertisers, of course, who always pitch by playing to our insecurities and then telling us that their product is somehow the solution to it. Repeated failed relationships in the quest for a male provider. So if a woman's got children and has been abandoned, frequently she will have a number of boyfriends, in each case hoping that that will be the replacement, the new provider. But men, always hard to tie down, are even harder to tie down if being tied down means providing for children who are not theirs. So that's even harder statistically. And that creates enormous domestic instability. And here we're pointing not just to the experience of the mother, but of the children who go through this. And that leads in the end to immense anger at men and the profound alienation between the sexes, right? And it's now practically normal in most Western countries, and it has been for a generation, for men and women to eye one another almost with suspicion or with hostility, but particularly hostility from women towards men, because their experience of men has been so bad. Whether it's a deficient father who abandoned them, or a husband or boyfriend who abandoned them and did so repeatedly. Well, if that's happened, if that's your experience, then your view of men generally is going to be pretty negative. But the same thing is going to be true of the rising generation of boys. And a lot of children find that home is a place of rouse and turmoil. And where that's the case, children are much, much harder to educate, as anybody who's been a teacher will know, right? That this can reduce a lot of children to the point of ineducability because there's no home support. And they've also taken on a whole load of behaviours which make being at all productive from an educational point of view in a classroom very, very, very hard indeed.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And as all studies show, that's going to lead to higher incidence of delinquency and later on crime.
Even in a healthy and well-adjusted home, I think women moms are in need of community support to raise children, and that's the way that it had always been done, I think, before now. So I do think that the sort of isolation that we find ourselves in now does also contribute to this to some extent.
That may not be related immediately to what we're talking about here, perhaps indirectly, because as Western societies have developed, people become much more mobile. Right? I mean, this has been something that's been creeping up on us since the Industrial Revolution, but has really taken legs, particularly amongst the middle classes from the middle of the 20th century. And so we move around. And so the likelihood that we're going to live near our parents, that the children are going to live near their grandparents, becomes more and more unlikely. And even nuclear families, once everybody in it is an adult, is going to get spread out geographically enormously.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking in terms of the devastation that this has wreaked on the family home. And so even if you had a bad experience with your family growing up, there's a good chance that you either don't talk to them anymore or are distant from them for some particular reason because of the results of this. And so even if you now have children, your parents are not the people that you're going to reach out to for support.
Right, right. And just to row back a little on this here, the whole sort of alienation between the sexes thing, and particularly the anger felt by many women towards men collectively. Do you sense among your acquaintances that a lot of women individually are angry at men collectively? Is that the sense that you have?
Yeah, I think that's like a trope that exists. It's hard to tell whether people really believe that, but certainly there'll be little comments that women might make, like, "Oh yeah, well, this would be a man's work," or something like that. Like, of course, a man would do something like that. But I think
But
in general,
that's the kind of thing that men and women have always said about one another, like among the guys, among the girls. But I mean something a little harsher than that. Somebody whose
yeah,
experience has been horrible and they feel jaded.
I think the word distrust that you used earlier is what comes to mind. I think that's a pretty strong sensation. Yeah.
Right. Well, I'm not someone who's overly given to introspection, but once I'd made the decision to spend the rest of my life in the Balkans, I I realised something about myself and just started to laugh. That one amongst many reasons that I hadn't thought about or admitted to myself, but it was definitely there, was that this is a part of the world where men and women talk to one another normally. Still,
Right.
where I am not presumptively guilty of all the sins of the universe on account of being a straight white male. So
Yes.
it's certainly there. Yeah.
Yeah, that must be a nice feeling.
Well, occasionally, yes. Well, while we're having such reactionary thoughts, let's consider an extremely reactionary tome here from 1994. This book was so controversial even back then that Geoffrey Dench, the sociologist at, I think it was Middlesex University, was reduced to, I don't know if Neanderthal Books is code for self-publishing, or it's some little outfit somewhere that published maybe 3 books ever, I don't know. His book was called The Frog, the Prince and the Problem of Men. And I just want to point out here 4 of his salient points. That women are the centre of human society and men are the periphery.
In what sense, though, are women the center of society? I mean, hasn't it traditionally been said that it's a man's world?
Yes, of course it has been said. And if we're talking about the public sphere, that certainly has been the case and arguably still is, despite all the efforts to change that, at least to some extent. But he's talking really here about socially and emotionally, that women are the center of families almost always. And that even before all the changes of the 1960s, although we think of this as like the patriarchy and the patriarchal age, if you actually get inside those families, or you listen to people's memoirs, or the way they talk about their upbringing, it was always, not always, 80% of the time, it was the mother that was the center of the home and basically gave the orders, right? And the man was the front to the outside world, right?
Yes.
And that was partly why the men dominated public space and the women dominated private space. Now, again, we don't want to overstate that. Like everybody, I had two sets of grandparents, and on the side of my mother's parents, there's no doubt who was the centre of the family there, and not just the nuclear home, but the extended family, and it was my grandma, right? She was the emotional centre of it, right? On the side of my dad's parents, you'd have to say it was more my father's father. Partly that was down to his character, rather domineering, but not bullying. He was just noisy. And my grandmother on that side was way too gentle, right?
Mm.
And I think kind of allowed that. That was something that started probably even before my dad was born, never mind before I was. But generally, you could say it would be about 80% would be that it was like a matriarchy in reality. And that continues to be the case today, that everybody, including men, depend for most of their relationships upon women, not necessarily in some sexual sense or a wife, but that certainly if that's there. But their friendships with women, yes, men have friends amongst themselves, but loads of their general relationships are mediated through women. If you want to measure that, just think about something trivial like the sending of birthday cards, right? That a significant majority of birthday cards would be sent by women, and an even bigger majority would be sent to women, right? I mean, this is, make no bounds about it. I make this, this is true in my own case, that most of the birthday cards I would send to other people would be to women, right? The only ones I ever sent to men were to my brother and my father. It would seem, well, a little odd, right?
I thought that you sent me birthday cards rather than my husband because you just loved me more.
Shh. I'm sure everybody does,
Right.
and like me,
Yeah.
they're all deluded. Now, that was mean. That was mean. Right. So, to that extent, men are the periphery. And that's reflected in much more important and weighty matters as well, like who gets to fight in a war. I mean, it's a terrible thing if you're thinking about the deaths of thousands upon thousands of people. But it's not just that men are physically stronger, though obviously they are, and that they have the testosterone for the aggression, though that's also true, but that societies can cope better with the loss of significant numbers of men than with significant numbers of women, because the number of women is the precise parameter of the size of your future population. Well, in consequence of this, Dench points out, boys require greater effort to become socialized into moral behavior. And if that sounds controversial, it doesn't even need to be argued, because everybody has experienced it and or witnessed it, that it's harder to socialize boys into decent behavior than girls. Of course, girls have their own ways of behaving extremely badly. They're usually rather different, right? But even making that important concession, they're generally easier to socialize because perhaps instinctively, or is it something socially learned? I can't answer to that. I defer instantly to someone who knows more than I do. Even the youngest girl can perceive herself as a future mother who is dependent upon relations of reciprocity with others to a degree and an intensity that a man is not. Right? Because the fatal problem with men is that they can always shrug their shoulders and walk off, which is sometimes a strength, but a lot of the times is a downright liability. Right? So he points out that patriarchy was a facade, a necessary facade. It was a piece of theatre, and it offered men inducements to perform and to contribute, because again, as we know, men are lazy. So they are over-rewarded by this facade of a public sphere, right? So they do at least make some important contributions. And he points out that current conditions make all of this impossible. We've swept all of that away, and this is why we have got hooliganized young men. I think we joked about it last time with, failure to launch and man boys and what have you. But it's no laughing matter, actually. So men have gone back to the woods, right? Because they can. So to sum up, what's the balance sheet of the 1960s sexual revolution? Well, on the plus side, if that's quite the right way to look at it, there's more consequence-free sex for better-looking men in their teens to 30s. The negative side is rather more impressive. Plummeting birth rates. Why would women have babies if there's no guarantee of future support? Leading to eventual economic decline as the dependency ratio on workers becomes unsustainable. Right? So we're now having way more old people than before relative to the number of people in work. And so they've got to be supported. And precisely because of that, the process intensifies itself, because apart from all the other disincentives to have children that we've mentioned here, there's now an economic one. You can't afford it, you will tell yourself. Yeah. There's been family disintegration. There's been single mothers bearing burdens alone, soaring youth delinquency, and later serious crime from young people brought up in unstable homes, the ineducability of children from dysfunctional households, sharply declining mental health as people feel wretched, depressed, and above all, worthless, alienation between men and women, with neither of them having a positive experience of relationship with an adult male, and the young men having basically no model for how they ought to behave. There has been no Papa Bear knocking them into shape, knocking Baby Bear into shape to, be a man, my son, and this is what you do. That's all for the birds now. And demographic decline leading to a need for sharply increased immigration, which people then complain about, leading to decreased social solidarity. So that's a pretty sobering assessment.
I find it unfortunate, ironic maybe, that the birth control pill was invented so that women could experience, freedom of sex in the same way that men could. But it's funny to me that it seems to be that women are mostly the ones that bear the consequences of this social disintegration.
Right. Now, in the 1960s, the Pope of the day, Paul VI, brought out an encyclical, I think that's the right term for it, Humanae Vitae, which basically said that good Catholics should not take the contraceptive pill, and was ridiculed for it, including by many Catholics. Now, this does come out of a whole load of theology that we can't actually quite go into here, finally going back to Augustine, who insists that sexual activity that can't lead to conception is intrinsically sinful, right? So if one wants to speak with scorn, then perhaps it should be of Augustine rather than Pope Paul VI. But nevertheless, we would have to say that in all of these other respects, the Catholic Church wasn't so very far wrong, because of the lamentable consequences that we've seen as a result of this. Right. So, yeah, we're going to follow this through further next week and see where this whole story takes us. But I think it's already pretty clear how this leads towards the current identity crisis that we are now experiencing in our own persons or witnessing amongst people around us. Yes.
Well, thanks everybody for sticking with us for another fun episode of Mike and I sort of pushing our way through the veil of Mount Olympus. And don't forget to like and share our videos everywhere that you can on our path to become rich and famous.
Absolutely. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye now.
Bye, everyone.